Chapter 24. The Gang Goes Shopping. Jack came back to his body like waking up from a dream, but that was the only part of what had just happened that seemed dreamlike. The vision, with lack of a better word, was not a dream, and he knew it just as well as he knew all the other times had not been dreams. Still, there was something about this time that felt too good to be true, and somehow too heavy to bear at the same time. He felt the cold ground beneath his legs and Toothless's ragged skin against his cheek. He blinked his eyes open, and Hiccup's dozing silhouette came into focus, dimly lit by the embers of the fire. He was holding his hands around in front of him like he was begging for money, and Jack realized why when Babytooth shifted in his palms. Hiccup woke up with a small jolt, sending Babytooth a slightly panicked look. In the same second, Jamie abruptly sat up, startling Hiccup even more.
What happened?
Hiccup asked. Jack didn't know why he was whispering. Giving himself a few more seconds to gather his emotions, Jack let out a quiet breath, closing his eyes. He wished Jamie hadn't touched the crystal. He wished he hadn't gone back there in the first place. He wished he could go back. His chest felt so indescribably heavy.
We're back,
Jamie explained feebly to Hiccup, who smiled uncertainly.
You didn't go anywhere?
He said slowly, though it sounded more like a question. Jamie didn't try to argue. Instead, his voice turned soft.
Jack?
Jack steeled himself to use his own voice.
Yeah,
he replied, and though he tried to sound unbothered, the weight in his chest pulled the word down to a quiet, weary murmur. It didn't sound convincing to himself. It wouldn't have sounded convincing to anyone. Hiccup was looking at him when Jack opened his eyes, unhidden concern in his expression.
You okay?
He asked. Jack pushed himself up and nodded. Jamie looked at him as though he hadn't seen him in years, and Jack didn't know what to do with that. Everything unspoken between them hung in the air like the electricity before a thunderstorm. After what they'd seen, Jack didn't know how to summon the strength to be big and grown up. It was as if he could still feel the warmth of his mother's hand covering his own, and her laugh as Jack proposed silly baby names to her. They'd all been silly on purpose. He'd already decided on the name Emily. Little Emily. All loud laughs and grubby baby hands stumbling over the creaking wooden floor to follow Jack's every whim. Bubbly Emily, with eyes wide with wonder at every tale and piece of faint wisdom a big brother would tell her. Jack's Emily, and he hadn't even remembered that he had been the one to give her that name. Jamie stood up on his knees and hugged Jack tightly. It left Jack a bit dazed, but it also brought him back to the present, their current present, anyway, and he let the tension seep out of his shoulders, bringing his arms around Jamie as well.
Do you have the crystal?
Jack whispered. Jamie nodded and slowly pulled back.
I'm not surprised you were an older brother,
he said with a faint smile, switching over to English. He handed Jack the crystal.
In fact, I suspected as much.
A smile so wide it surprised Jack himself spread over his own face at those words, and he laughed.
I'll tell you about her,
he promised. Babytooth chirped a soft tune, and Jack turned to her, holding the crystal up between two fingers. Beside her, Hiccup's jaw went slack.
How?
He started helplessly. Told you they multiply, Jack said. He scooped up the other crystals, then looked around with a frown. You moved us in our sleep? He asked, holding back a laugh. Hiccup didn't seem to register the question, as he just stared blankly at Jack. Then he shrugged.
What happened just now?
A vision, Jack replied, as if he actually had a clue. Well, sort of. Jamie found the new crystal within it and brought it back here to the real world? He scratched his cheek, looking down at his feet with an expression he knew was forlorn, but he couldn't help it. Either way, we did what we set out to. Things are going according to the non-existent plan. Hiccup nodded slowly. His eyes were darting nervously to where Babytooth was floating in the air, but tried to seem unbothered. He had about as much success as Jack.
Wonderful,
he said. He then seemed to struggle with his words, his eyes scanning Jack's face. It was obvious he was curious to know what had happened to plunge Jack into such a melancholy mood.
What now?
He asked instead, which Jack appreciated. The others, save for Toothless, who was snoozing peacefully at their backs, shared a look. Find new magic, I guess? Jack replied. Jamie looked out into the darkness with a doubtful frown.
Tomorrow,
he said.
Tomorrow,
Hiccup agreed, clearly not too stoked about the prospect of potentially meeting another knock.
We can leave at first light.
Unless it starts to snow, Jack added. Hiccup swallowed and nodded once.
You're the expert,
he muttered uneasily, and Jack didn't know if he managed to hide the momentary surprise he felt at those words, before he realized Hiccup meant magical stuff in general, and not magical snow. "Shall we keep watch?" Jack asked, because he was already pretty certain he wouldn't be able to get much sleep if he tried. To his dread, Hiccup shook his head.
"Toothless will hear if we get company," he said. "Let's just all get some rest. We'll fly to the market tomorrow and—" He shook his head, taking a deep breath. "Maybe we'll find some magical salesmen or something. Those are generally a bit friendlier than what we met in the woods."
Jack cracked a smile. Hiccup worried a lot, and at this point it wasn't unwarranted, but at least he always found ways to joke about his troubles. They settled down to sleep after Hiccup reinvigorated the fire, huddling up against Toothless's warm scales. It was a tight squeeze under the blanket, but there was an unspoken agreement that it was better that way. Even if they'd had several blankets, sharing body heat would keep them as warm as possible. The only downside was that Jack knew he'd have to lie completely still so as to not wake any of the others. Jamie lay between Jack and Hiccup, and Jack could hear his breathing slowly even out. He was the first one to fall asleep. Hiccup followed a while after, and though Jack was pretty sure they both knew the other was awake, they both kept still. Baby Tooth had settled in the crook of Jamie's neck, hidden beneath the blanket. And then Jack was the only one awake. It stayed that way for a long time. He kept his eyes closed, trying to breathe in an even rhythm. The weather outside was still. All he could hear was the soft lapping of waves against stone, the crackling from the fire, and the gentle heartbeat from Toothless's chest. Hiccup made some noises in his sleep every now and then, some incoherent mumbling or the occasional snore, like a foreboding reminder that he was his father's son, and those soft snores might turn less soft with the years. Jack was exhausted in every way. It took absurdly long for him to begin nodding off, but once he did, it turned out to be fruitless anyway. Every time sleep began to take his hold on him, his mind plunged back to the murky waters of Knockin's Marsh. His lungs would stop responding, and he'd awake with a gasp, again and again until he gave up. As gingerly as he could, he scooted away from Jamie and got to his feet. His boots and the rest of his clothes were drying by the fire, but they were still too wet to put back on. He wandered out of the shelter barefoot, wrapping his arms around himself. He missed his cloak, but if he just didn't think about it, he could almost convince himself that the cold wasn't that bad. He sat down by the lone tree, pulling his legs up to his chest. A part of his mind wondered why he hadn't just sat down by the fire. Another part of his mind rolled its eyes at the first part, because that was obvious, wasn't it? Jack lowered his forehead to his knees when his own actual eyes began to water. It made him scoff at himself. It had been a good few decades since the last time he'd cried twice in one day. With his mind muddled with mead, he'd wondered about his favorite laughs. His mother's, though he hadn't at the time remembered it, made the list out of pure assumption that Jack must have loved it. And that was true. He remembered it now. Lilting and warm, like a safer and more grounded version of Jack's own laugh. And his father. Jack still didn't remember much about him, but at least now he knew why. There hadn't been much to remember in the first place, because he'd been gone so fast. Certain moments of the vision they'd just observed, Jack could still envision from his younger self's point of view. The deeply compassionate way his father had gazed at little Jack had gone over Jack's head at the time. Seeing it again had felt like a rumble of faraway lightning, loud and unmistakable, almost overwhelming, but the lightning itself was long gone. A new kind of hollowness had opened up in Jack's chest, where he wished his memories of his father could be. And then there was the abyss that this new knowledge left behind. Jack's mother had lost her husband, and then her son. Jack had never regretted what he did on the frozen pond that day, but for the first time he felt the painful stab of resentment directed at his own recklessness. If he'd just been careful, he could have noticed that the ice was too thin before it was too late. He never would have become Jack Frost, but at least he could have had his family for longer than those fleeting 17 years. He could have heard his mother's laugh so many more times, and he never would have forgotten the sound of it. The touch of her hand, the smile in her eyes, the endless love she harbored for her children. Jack had made it all disappear, and he would never get it back. The tears on his cheeks felt biting in the cold, soft wind, and he wiped them away. His fingers were numb, though he was pretty sure he hadn't been sitting under the tree for long. His toes were in an even worse state, but he couldn't bring himself to care about it. He'd already died of hypothermia. Maybe frostbite wasn't so bad in comparison. Just as the thought passed through his mind, something abruptly landed on his head and draped itself over his body. He gave a yelp and pulled the blanket off, looking up. Jamie stood a couple of meters away, shifting his weight.
"Hi,"
he said. Jack sighed, lowering his gaze. Go to sleep, Jamie, he muttered.
Can't sleep.
You were sleeping last time I checked.
And then I wasn't.
Jamie came closer and sat down beside him, crossing his legs. He glanced at Jack, then looked out at the sea.
Hiccup woke up too when you left. He asked me to check on you.
Jack forcefully pushed away the disappointment he felt at the fact that Hiccup hadn't just done that himself instead of sending Jamie. He could see that the fire was brighter now than before, so Hiccup was obviously still awake in there. But either way, he wasn't sure if he'd appreciate Hiccup's company right now. Not really Jamie's either. He just wanted to be alone. But Jamie stayed where he was, so Jack shifted to give him some space to lean against the tree. He draped the blanket over them both, and then they sat there.
You're sad,
Jamie eventually murmured. It took Jack a few seconds to reply. Yeah, he said.
Do you miss her?
He missed her so much, Jack didn't have the words to describe it. He nodded. Then he turned his head away in hope that Jamie wouldn't see the fresh tears trailing down his cheek. It felt so wrong to let his sorrow seep through in front of him. It was the same kind of shame he'd felt at the thought of Jamie seeing him intoxicated. That wasn't Jack Frost. That was just some stupid, vulnerable teenager. Stupid, vulnerable Jackson Overland. But there wasn't much point in trying to hide that anymore, was it? Jamie was quiet. He leaned his head against Jack's shoulder.
You're not alone, Jack,
he said, and though he sounded seconds away from choking up, he managed to keep his voice steady, even firm, like he knew, in absolute certainty, that that was the case. And Jack felt himself smile. He wiped away the tears, sniffled, then nudged his head gently against Jamie's. I know that, he said, but thanks for reminding me. Jamie made a sound as if he wanted to speak, but was too choked up to do so. He was too empathetic to give anyone a pep talk without ending up in need of a pep talk of his own. Jack couldn't help but chuckle. I just didn't expect it, is all, he said, seeing her again. Jamie barely nodded.
I was surprised too,
he said, and Jack was glad to hear it seemed the lump in the throat had eased a little.
Were you born in the summer?
It's not like I had a choice. It warranted a laugh from Jamie, and Jack grinned.
Did you like the summer better then?
Jamie straightened up with a curious frown, but the frown loosened up when he met Jack's eyes. Jack guessed his eyes must be puffy or his cheeks blotched red.
We don't have to talk about it if you...
Jamie started to mumble, but trailed off when Jack smiled and shook his head. It's been a long while coming already, he said. He leaned back against the tree and looked at the ocean without really looking at it. I know you're curious, and even if it's difficult to talk about them, it's nice as well. To think about them in that time. I've only just started to remember it myself, after all.
What's that like?
Jamie asked. To remember? Jack pursed his lips. Confusing, overwhelming, exhilarating. He closed his eyes. A little sad. Maybe more than a little. But happy, too. Jamie went quiet. When Jack opened his eyes again, he saw him looking out at the sea with his mouth hanging slightly ajar.
Did you call your sister Emily in the end?
He asked. Jack grinned. Yeah, though some people called her Flea from how fast she could run and jump around. Jamie met his eyes for a moment, a faint smile on his face. Then he started to frown again.
You don't really look like your dad,
he observed. For some reason, this made Jack's cheeks feel warm. I guess not, he said.
He had wrinkles. Well, not a lot. Some.
Jamie pointed at the corner of his eye.
Crow's feet, and some lines on his forehead.
The picture of him appeared in Jack's mind, and he held on to it for a few moments before he had to let it go again, like a cup of tea that still needed to cool down. He was old, or oldish, Jack said, then shrugged. An adult. Jamie's gaze shifted, his lips pressing shut. Jack waited for him to ask the question that was obviously on his mind, but he remained silent. Go on, then. Ask. Jack chuckled. Jamie folded his hands nervously.
Why didn't you become an adult? He asked.
It felt as though the world had slowed down around them. The lapping of the waves seemed gentler, and the wind dimmed to a quiet rushing in the distance. Jack hadn't told the story to anyone before. Not in detail, anyway. It's not a happy story, Jamie, he said quietly. I can tell you, but you need to know that first. Don't be... He hesitated, folding his own hands. Don't be scared. Jamie sent him a wary look, but then nodded. I won't, he promised. And somehow, Jack knew he could believe him. He took a deep breath, wondering how he should say it. if he should include the details he'd kept to himself ever since he got his memories back. How Emily had been around the age Jamie was when he first saw Jack, that it had been in early January when the ice was supposed to be at its thickest, that they'd both gotten ice skates for Christmas just because Emily wanted them and Jack knew she'd want him along. But it wasn't a tale. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't entertaining. It was a tragic, irreversible moment. It was just a fact. Right now, sitting in front of the black ocean in the cold, that was all Jack managed to feel about it. Emily and I were out ice skating. I thought the ice was thick enough, but it started cracking beneath her. Jack's voice was bland and quiet as he spoke. Still, his mouth quirked slightly upwards in an imitation of a smile. That's when I found the staff. I used it to get her out of harm's way, but it was too late for me. He paused for a moment. His gaze rested on the spot where the waves washed up against stone. I didn't come out of that pond as Jackson Overland. Jackson Overland was... He drowned in that pond. Jamie's breathing had gone still. It took a long time before he found his voice again.
And you became Jack Frost? You died to become Jack Frost?
Jack had already mused an extraordinary amount about the irony of perishing in winter's icy clutches, only to spend the next 300 years convincing everyone else, to the best of his ability, what a wonderful and fun time those dark months could bring. And the weirdest thing was that even after getting his memories back, knowing full well what had happened, he still stood by it. Winter was fun. He'd just been one of the unlucky ones. Makes it all seem a little less wonderful, doesn't it? He asked with an apologetic smile. It's fine, Jamie. I don't remember the exact moment. I remember the ice giving away, the cold, and then... He shook his head. And then I saw the moon. I just wish I knew what happened to Emily and Mom after that day.
I'm sorry, Jamie said.
He was pouting at the ground.
Jack, how do you act so happy when so many sad things have happened to you?
Jack had wondered the same thing many times, before and after getting his memories back. But nobody ever addressed it, not Jack or anyone else, because Jack always kept it to himself. He didn't want the Guardians' pity. He didn't want them to look at him like the lonely, invisible boy he'd been for so long. He knew they were all thinking it sometimes, but they never tried to bring it up. But Jamie was Jamie, and he had the ability to make Jack's heart bleed and mend at the same time. The question circled in his head as if he'd never truly asked it himself. Because he had, but he'd never really gotten as far as answering it, had he? Despite everything, he'd never described himself as a melancholy person. Thinking about it, he thought he had much reason to. But what he liked thinking about instead was his ability to see the light in the dark. He didn't like dwelling on the sadness, though it was sometimes too loud to ignore, like now. But what mattered was that he hoped, so fiercely that he would claim he knew he'd be happy again eventually. That's how he'd gotten through those 300 years, and that's how he would get through this. Things will be all right, Jamie, he said. Above all that, I have many things to be happy about, too, so I don't act happy. I am happy. He pursed his lips, leaving out the generally he wanted to add. Just because he was sad right now didn't mean he was going to sully important life advice given to an 11-year-old. I will be happy, so don't worry about that. Jamie nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced.
Would you go back if you could?
He asked. No. Yes. Jack didn't know. It felt like an impossible question. It wasn't just that his yearning to get back what he'd lost rivaled his sense of duty. He did enjoy being Jack Frost. He liked riding the wind and bringing winter with him, seeing the smiles of thousands of children upon spotting those first flakes of snow falling from a white sky. He liked playing pranks, and he liked discreetly orchestrating those perfect, quiet moments that made people reach out for each other's hands and huddle up. He loved being a part of something so huge and important. He loved being a part of the Guardians. He loved the Guardians. He loved a lot of things that had come to him as a result of being Jack Frost. And as much as he loved that, he also loved the things that had come as a result of becoming Jackson Overland again. But at the same time, he loved his mother, and he loved his sister. He loved his father, too, though he'd never known him that well. He wished he'd gotten the time to know him better. He wished he could have stayed with them so that his mom wouldn't have to suffer the loss of them both. That was the one thing he could scarcely bring himself to think about. How his mother must have grieved for him. All of a sudden, Guilt swelled on his chest. Like a knife, he remembered that if he didn't do things right, he wouldn't be the only one present to lose a mother and a little sister. He started, forgetting about Jamie's question. He bowed his head and ran a hand over his face. I need to tell you something, Jamie. I should have told you before, but I didn't want to worry you more. Judging by the way Jamie's eyes widened with panic, it was the wrong way to start this conversation.
Oh no, are you dying?
No, Jack quickly said, though the question made him horribly aware of his renewed mortality. He mentally shook his head. He couldn't think about that now. No, it's not about me. It's about something the Guardians told me when I saw them. About you. It was hard to get the words out. Jamie's concerned expression didn't waver, and so Jack did his best not to drag out the time. The time we spent here is parallel to our present, he explained, holding Jamie's gaze the best he could, which means that, even when we go back to the present, we won't go back to the exact moment we were taken by the time fragment. We will have been gone for as long as we've spent our time here. Jamie's concern turned into confusion for a moment, and then to a dawning realization.
But we've been here for...
He started weakly, looking blankly in the air. Then he met Jack's eyes again.
In the present, I've gone missing.
Jack nodded. I don't know if the Guardians have tried to help, he said. Maybe they've informed Sophie somehow, but I doubt it.
I went missing in the woods, Jamie muttered, after my mom told me not to go too deep, too.
We'll get back, Jack said. We'll gather the pieces of the crystal and... He didn't know what would happen even if they did gather the pieces. Maybe nothing. Maybe they truly were stuck in the past. But he couldn't think like that. And we'll get you back home. Jamie's eyes were shimmering, but he nodded.
Maybe if you see the Guardians again, ask them to tell Pippa and the others, he said. They can know, right?
Jack tried to smile in a reassuring way. Yeah, he said. I'll ask them if I see them again. And if not, then your friends and family will see you again someday anyway. Just focus on that.
How would we explain that? Jamie asked. I go missing and I turn up again, like, months later? Years, maybe, even?
His voice dwindled to silence. We'll find a way you can explain yourself, Jack said, even if he had no idea. That was the least of their problems. Jamie scooted sideways and hugged Jack suddenly. He didn't say anything, but Jack could only imagine how far from home he must feel right now. Jamie gave a quavering sigh, shaking slightly against Jack, and Jack couldn't help in any other way than to hug him back. I'm sorry, Jamie, he whispered. I should have told you before. Jamie shook his head a little.
It's okay,
he mumbled. It wasn't, but Jack didn't try to argue. We'll fix this, he promised, running his hand through Jamie's hair. We've faced greater threats. He said it like a fact, though he wasn't sure if it was still true. Jamie didn't feel rested the next morning. The sun was coming up, and since Hiccup had put out the fire, he sat pressed against Toothless, stroking his head absently. Jack was trying on his boots, and Jamie guessed they were still a bit wet by the way his nose wrinkled. He put his cloak back on, careful not to move his injured arm too much. Baby Tooth chirped at him, and Jack laughed. Did Tooth tell you that? He asked, and Jamie didn't have the energy to ask what she had said. Hiccup was watching them with a vaguely bothered expression, but when he noticed Jamie looking at him, he smiled sheepishly and wiped the discomfort off his face. So, he said, in a way that reminded Jamie a little too much of his English teacher. What's the plan? Let's fly towards the market and take it from there, Jack said reassuringly. Baby Tooth will notice if there's something magical nearby. And maybe you too, Hiccup.
Me?
Hiccup's voice broke a little, and he cleared his throat.
That was a one-time thing. I haven't felt anything magical before that.
Baby Tooth whistled disapprovingly, shaking her head. You sure about that? Jack asked. Hiccup hesitated. He gave a weak laugh.
Let's fly, shall we?
Jamie perked up at the same time as Toothless.
Can I sit in front this time?
He asked hopefully. Jack beamed at him. Sure, I'll sit in the back. We can make a plan on the way.
That's literally the opposite of how planning works, but okay,
Hiccup muttered. It was a bright new day, and Jamie felt the same rush of excitement as he'd felt in the beginning of this journey, soaring through his body as Toothless leapt off the rock and carried them into the sky. He held his hands up like he was on a roller coaster, causing Hiccup to put a hand on his shoulder while the other one held onto the handles of the saddle, as if he was afraid he was going to jump off. But, to be fair, Hiccup did think Jamie was related to Jack, so it wasn't an irrational worry to have. They split the cloud layer and entered the cotton candy kingdom, colored pink and orange by the rising sun. Jamie made awing sounds, turning around to share his excitement with Hiccup. Hiccup, however, had his brows deeply furrowed and only tried for a tiny smile when he met Jamie's eyes.
"It's pretty,"
he stated. Jamie shook his head exasperatedly.
"I know you've done this a lot, but I don't get how you can ever get used to it," he said. "Do you ever get bored of flying?"
Behind Hiccup, Jack squinted as if he was preparing to judge Hiccup if he answered wrong.
"Absolutely not,"
Hiccup laughed, and Jack's squint softened.
"No, I'm just tired. Still trying to wrap my head around this, I guess. Where's the fairy?"
"Baby Tooth," Jack said, "is her name. She's in my cloak." Jamie snorted. Even if Hiccup wasn't used to magic and seemed prejudiced towards thinking it was inherently bad, being scared of a tooth fairy was ridiculous. Trains dragons but can't relax while being in the presence of a fairy the size of his little finger. He'd come around to it, though, Jamie was sure. Hiccup nodded slowly.
"Good,"
he repeated, his voice still ringing with the hollow acceptance of a man who's seen the impossible.
"So, are we going to talk about what happened last night, or are we just going to let it hang in the air?"
"Sorry for waking you," Jack mumbled awkwardly.
"Oh, no, not that," Hiccup said. "I meant the passing out part, the vision and the crystal. What kind of vision was that?"
"Well, it's not a vision exactly," Jack said uncertainly. "I'm not sure what it is, but it takes us to other places. Each time we find a crystal. My guess is that the magic that created the crystal is binding the broken pieces together."
"What happens if you collect them all?"
Hiccup asked. Jack went quiet for a few seconds. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I don't know." It wasn't the most reassuring thing to hear, but Jamie couldn't blame him.
"What do you mean it takes you to other places? Like,"
Hiccup sounded like he struggled getting the next words out.
"Like your souls?"
Jamie shivered at the thought. "Maybe," Jack said, his voice quiet in the wind. They flew in silence for a few long moments, this new hypothesis ringing eerily in the air around them.
"So did you see those, guardians?"
Hiccup asked, trying to keep his voice light. He pronounced guardians strangely.
"No,"
Jack mumbled dejectedly. "I only saw them the first time. I was hoping each crystal would lead me back to them in case they found a way to help us, but since then it's just been—" He trailed off, and Jamie turned around to look at him.
"Do you think it's random where they take us?" he asked.
Jack's eyes went distant. "I'm not sure," he said. He then opened his mouth before giving the back of Hiccup's head an uneasy look. He met Jamie's eyes again. "It took us to Berg, and obviously none of us have been there before. Seems pretty random to me. But at the same time, Burgess, Hawthorne, seems a bit funny, doesn't it?" Jamie nodded slowly.
"But you didn't recognize being at that one place," he said, "with the dancing couple?"
"That's true," Jack mumbled. "It was during winter, though. Maybe—" He trailed off again, but Jamie got what he was trying to say. Even if they hadn't seen Jack there, he might have been around, bringing winter to Burgess. Still, that didn't explain why the crystal had been inside the girl's present.
"Maybe we'll find out with the next one,"
Jamie suggested hopefully. Hiccup looked troubled and very confused.
"Are you sure following the crystals is a good idea?" he asked. Maybe it's better to wait and see if we can find the way back to your home another way."
Jamie lowered his gaze and turned ahead. "We don't have the time," Jack said. "Angry snow spirit and everything." Hiccup sighed tiredly.
"Right. Then could I ask again if there isn't any way to stop her? I mean, we have firepower. Fire melts ice."
"Acute observation, Hiccup. Fire does melt ice," Jack said, then laughed when Hiccup elbowed him. "But you saw how strangely Toothless acted in the marsh." Baby Tooth chirped softly, and Jack added, "And after meeting the Snow Queen."
"But—"
Hiccup started and sounded vaguely like Sophie when she tried to protest her bedtime. Then he sighed gruffly.
"I guess you're right. I just know I'll never look at winter the same way again after this. It was already bad before I knew someone was purposefully orchestrating it."
Jack was quiet. Jamie could all but feel the minus in friendship signs from the Sims appearing over their heads. It was dark again by the time they arrived at the marketplace, But despite that, the market was still very much alive. People were selling clothes and weapons, food and meat, or showcased clutters of treasure made out of shiny rings and necklaces and other types of jewelry. The market was located by the harbor, and people were milling about, carrying boxes and barrels onto and off the ships. Behind the bustle of it all, a small village spread out, lit up by torches and a hearth in the middle of a muddy square. They landed somewhere there weren't a lot of people, in case anyone who hadn't seen a Night Fury before would freak out, then strolled with numb legs and sore bottoms into the market. "This is nice," Jack commented. "Love the smell of fish. Do you think they sell anything other than seafood here?"
"Doubt it," Hiccup said. "Come on, I know a place that's," he pursed his lips, "nice adjacent."
Jamie took in the place as they walked through it. He got eye contact with a few sketchy-looking sailors, which caused him to walk a little closer to Jack, but otherwise the marketplace seemed relatively safe and civilized. Compared to Burke, anyway. Jamie supposed the standards had changed somewhat after living there for a while. This was nothing like what he'd always imagined Vikings to be like when they read about them in the history books, or even less so when he read about them in his adventure novels. Hiccup led them to the point where the village and the market connected, walking them towards a house that just looked like someone's home. But there was chatter and laughter coming from the inside, and a sign was hanging at the door. Jamie hadn't learned the runes etched into it, but he guessed it said something like "open," because Hiccup opened the door without knocking first. The room was filled with people of the type, like the sailors Jamie had seen on their way here, all gruff and grimy and grim. None of them paid them any attention as they walked in, until Toothless wiggled in through the narrow doorway. The conversation died down suddenly, causing the opposite side of the room to wonder why the other side had gone so quiet. Very quickly, the room was dead silent. Hiccup pressed his lips shut, shifting awkwardly.
Hi,
he said. A head popped down from the narrow staircase, a middle-aged woman with bright red hair and flushed cheeks. She grinned when she spotted them.
"Hiccup!"
she exclaimed, and then put her hand to her mouth, yelling up to the second floor.
"Sweetheart, we've got royalty visiting."
Hiccup gave a weak groan, then glowered at Jack when he laughed. The woman bounded downstairs, then waved dismissively at the crowd.
"Right, I am sure you've seen more exciting things in your day," she said.
Jamie wondered if that was a purposeful attempt at insulting every guest's old age and their little group's tired state at the same time. The room tentatively began filling up with chatter again. The woman smiled broadly at Hiccup when she approached him and pulled him into a tight hug.
"We haven't seen you here in a while." Yeah, sorry. Burke's been busy," Hiccup said with an apologetic laugh.
The woman beamed.
"How's your father? It's been even longer since I saw him. Oh, hi there."
She'd spotted Jack and Jamie, her eyes shifting quickly between the two of them before landing on Hiccup again.
"Friends of yours? Can't remember seeing them around on Burke before."
Hiccup gestured to both sides of himself.
"Jack and Jamie, this is Edon. Edon, this is Jack and Jamie," he said.
Edon grinned at them both.
"Friends of Hiccup's are friends of ours. Do you want to sit? You look exhausted."
She nodded at them to follow her before anyone could get a word in. Then, once they'd sat down on a bench against the wall with a tiny three-legged table, a bit further away from the other guests to Jamie's relief, she said hi to Toothless, who reminded Jamie a lot of how happy Abby got whenever Jamie's aunt came to visit, then disappeared to another room. Hiccup smiled exasperatedly.
"She talks a lot," he explained.
Jack leaned towards him with his head resting on his palm. "I keep forgetting you're a prince, Hiccup," he said with a devious grin. "Apologies for never kneeling when you enter the room. If you ever need someone to wash your feet—" Hiccup had shoved Jack's elbow off the table, nearly making Jack's face collide with the wood.
"You're hilarious,"
he said flatly, and though his cheeks were quickly turning a bright shade of red, there was a stubborn smile on his face. Jack and Jamie laughed. Hiccup explained that the owners of this house, Edon and Rune, often opened their home to traveling traders and sailors. It had started small, with them only letting people they knew in, but eventually those people started bringing friends, and the friends started bringing friends, and soon enough they had a small business going. The food wasn't much, as Jack had guessed, mostly seafood, but Hiccup proclaimed their meat was tasty at least. Jack made a face.
"Meat?"
"Meat," Hiccup repeated, smiling impishly.
"Did that one night scare you off already?"
"No," Jack replied, a tad defensively. "I'd just like to have all my senses intact if we're going to find any magic—" He cringed and looked around. "If we're going to find what we're looking for," he said instead.
"Do they have water?"
Jamie piped up, and was glad some of his friends weren't there, because they'd definitely tease him for turning down a chance to drink alcohol. He doubted the Vikings had particularly strict drinking laws. Hiccup opened his mouth to answer, but then jerked his head back a little when Baby Tooth appeared, hovering over the table. She chirped something to Jack. "Okay," Jack said. "Be careful though, all right?" Baby Tooth replied, and Jack gave her a fond smile, at which she replied with a bashful smile of her own before disappearing.
"What was that?"
Hiccup asked, with the same sort of bothered look he'd worn earlier. "She said she'd look around," Jack said, leaning his head on his hand again. "If this place had a lot of people going through it, it's not unlikely that we find some kind of loaded, energized spot." Jamie rubbed his chin.
"We should come up with a code word," he declared. "Like..."
They pondered about this for a moment. "Teeth?" Jack suggested. Jamie frowned.
"Baby Tooth is a bad influence," he told him. "It has to be something that's not weird. This place has a lot of people coming through. It's not unlikely that we find teeth."
This made Jack laugh. "Okay, good point."
"Crystals?"
Hiccup volunteered.
"It might make people think we're after something valuable, making them come after us,"
Jamie said in a conspiring mumble, the adventure novel part of his brain beginning to go into overdrive.
"It's got to be something normal."
Hiccup pursed his lips.
"Rocks?" "That's boring," Jamie said,
making Hiccup throw his arms out.
"It's normal. Normal but boring."
Jack was clearly struggling to keep a straight face. "What do you think, then?" he asked, giggles in his voice. Jamie hummed.
What about traces?" "How's that less boring than rocks?"
Hiccup argued.
"It's mystical," Jamie insisted. "And that's what it is, isn't it? Traces of you know what. Unless it's actually a spirit, I mean."
He looked around.
"A legend."
Jake tilted his head to the side. "A legend?" he repeated, and Jamie felt his cheeks flush.
"You know what I mean. So, since a lot of people pass through this island, you're saying there's a high possibility we'll find traces or legends?"
Hiccup summarized, and Jamie capitalized the words in his head. That's how it would have been written in a fantasy story.
"Why?"
"Legends and people go hand in hand," Jack said. "They're connected, and people coming from all around. Who knows what kind of stories they bring with them? Some humans practice magic too, which would leave behind." He gestured at Jamie and finished matter-of-factly. "Traces."
"Jack, the code names won't help if you still throw around the M word," Jamie said.
"All right. Martial arts, then," Jack said. "Some humans practice martial arts." Jamie burst out laughing, but then promptly shut his mouth when a tall figure appeared in front of the table. It was a man with a short, graying beard and the most luscious-looking blonde hair Jamie had seen on any Viking until this point. It flowed down his shoulders like a shampoo commercial. His expression was positively hostile.
"Long time, Rune,"
Hiccup then said, getting to his feet. "Indeed," Rune said, quirking the tiniest of smiles. He and Hiccup took each other's arms, and then he grabbed a chair and pulled it to their table, sitting down. He nodded at Jack and Jamie. "Haven't seen you around before," he noted. Jamie shook his head a little.
"They're friends of mine," Hiccup said. Distant family?"
Rune raised his brows. "Really? You don't look related." "Very distant," Jack said with a small laugh. "Fair enough," Rune said, but it didn't sound like he entirely believed them. It didn't sound like he entirely cared either. Jamie guessed he'd had his fair share of sketchy visitors, and if he already knew Hiccup, then he probably also knew that he had a tendency to get into all sorts of trouble. "Eden's in the other room. I think she's trying to find the tastier meat for you. Told her not to." Hiccup snorted.
"Because you want it all for yourself."
"Right you are," Rune said with a crooked smile. "Just because you're royalty doesn't mean you get special treatment, if I had any say in it."
"Ha-ha,"
Hiccup groused.
"You can tell her there's no need, though. I think we'll stick with water this time."
Rune got to his feet. "That's what I like to hear," he said, and it was the most cheerful Jamie had seen him ever since he sat down. He stomped off in the same direction Eden had gone. Jack looked after him with a thoughtful expression. "He reminds me of someone," he murmured, before a light went up in his eyes. "He reminds me of Bunny." And that was the most delighted Jamie had seen Jack in a little while.
"Bunny?"
Hiccup asked, his brows furrowing.
"The one you said you annoy for fun?"
"That would be the one." Hiccup looked into the air with a contemplating expression.
"I wouldn't advise you to do the same with Rune,"
he eventually concluded. "Oh, I wouldn't," Jack said, still grinning. "I wouldn't annoy Bunny that much either if I couldn't run fast enough." Jamie stared at him, wondering what sort of fury Jack had managed to unleash in the Easter Bunny of all people. Well, to be fair, the Easter Bunny was a lot less cute and fuzzy than what most depictions of him argued, but he was still the Easter Bunny. The homesickness seemed to hit both Jamie and Jack at the same time, as they gave out matching sighs. Hiccup's expression softened.
You'll annoy him again soon enough, he promised, and Jack sent him a grateful smile.
Idun came back with 3 tankards of water, reassuring them all that the meat was there for them if they changed their minds. The water came with 3 bowls of a kind of soup that, despite it all, wasn't fish, and to Jamie's wonder, didn't smell or taste horrible. It had pieces of meat in it, sheep, Idun informed them, and potato. Jamie didn't know if it was because Berg had made the standards bury themselves so deep into the ground that archaeologists would dig them up sometime in the future and call them relics, or if the food was actually the best thing he'd ever eaten. Toothless got a basket of fish all for himself, and they all ate with gusto. When they'd finished, Jamie's eyelids were pleasantly heavy, and he rested his head on the table. He could have fallen asleep here if he wanted to, and he didn't even care that they were surrounded by old rusty sailors. Jack patted his back lightly. "Where do we sleep tonight?" he asked. Hiccup yawned.
"If it's not too much trouble, I could ask Eden and Rune if they have some extra space for the night," he said. "If not, we have enough silver to ask for shelter somewhere else. Either way, we don't need to huddle up for warmth tonight. I've already decided."
"Great," Jack said, and yawned as well. "Love it when you're stubborn."
I don't know if I should take that as a compliment or not."
Rune came back to sit with them after a little while, a tankard in his hand, and slightly pinker ears than before. "So what brings you here, young haddock?" he drawled. "Did your dad send you?" Hiccup looked like he was fighting off the urge to roll his eyes. He shook his head.
"Just showing Jack and Jamie the archipelago," he said. "Nothing special."
"No trouble?" Rune asked with a knowing quirk of his brow.
Hiccup didn't immediately answer, and when he then replied, "No," Rune started to laugh. It was a quiet, sort of haughty laugh, and Jamie thought he could see why Jack saw Bunny in him.
Right, he said. "Well, good luck with that." Hiccup went a fade shade of pink.
"Thanks," he muttered. Rune, I was wondering, do you know if there's any way that would take us in for the night?"
Rune smirked. "Try again." Hiccup deadpanned.
"Would you mind us sleeping here for the night?"
"Chief's son gotta be direct," Rune said, shoving Hiccup's shoulder. "No worries. You, your little friends, and your dragon are more than welcome. Can't promise you that it'll be quiet, though. We keep our doors open most of the night."
"As long as it's warm, I couldn't care less," Hiccup sighed. "Thanks, Rune."
"What do we do for a little, Hiccup?" Rune ruffled Hiccup's hair, and Hiccup swatted him half-heartedly away. He got to his feet. "I'll tell Eden. Enjoy your evening, lads." Then he walked away, swaying a little more than before. Jack let out another sigh, then translated his words to English using a horrible Australian accent. "Enjoy your evening, lads." He grinned at Jamie. "Can't you just hear him?" Jamie giggled. Hiccup smiled uncertainly. "It's not too late to look around, right?" Jack asked, getting to his feet. "We may be in a hurry, but I do actually want you to show us the archipelago, Hiccup.
Why not start with this market?"
Hiccup looked mildly desperate.
"We just sat down," he said.
Jamie almost wanted to agree, but Jack's eyes were alight with excitement, and it was quickly rubbing off on him. "And we'll have loads of time to do that again soon," Jack said, and linked his arm in Hiccup's, beginning to drag him up. "Besides, Toothless is the only one with a real reason to be exhausted. But you didn't see him complaining, do you? Right, Toothless?" Toothless was still licking the remnants of fish from the basket, but looked up with a goofy grin when Jack called his name. His tail accidentally knocked someone's table over in the process, and Jamie swiftly stepped behind Hiccup when the attention turned to them.
"Oops, sorry," Hiccup said with a nervous laugh. "Maybe you're right. We should go."
They left the house before anyone had the time to really get angry, and Jamie spotted Eden on the way out, shaking her head with a fond smile. The market didn't seem any less crowded than earlier, even if the moon was already high in the sky. Jamie supposed it wasn't as late as it looked. The sun just didn't really try that hard these days. As they weaved through the crowd, Jamie walked close with Toothless, and eventually just hopped onto his back. Toothless barely seemed to notice anyway. That way, burly Vikings with brooding expressions tended to keep away. Jamie thought he'd gotten used to Vikings, but he was slowly beginning to realize that maybe Burkians were a special brand of Viking that Jamie had just gotten used to before they had to leave. They stopped by several different stands, but avoided most of the sellers' attempts at making them buy anything. However, when they stopped by a stand selling furs, Hiccup started to haggle with the seller, until he was holding a small brown vest in his hands. He handed it to Jamie. "This'll keep you warm," he said. Jamie put it on and desperately wished he had a mirror. And Hiccup was right. He was already warming up. Jack beamed at them both. Hiccup stopped by another stand and repeated the process. Jamie was a bit surprised to see how adamant he could be, but when he made that comment to Jack in a low voice, Jack just shook his head. His stubbornness is relentless. The worst I've seen in any person ever, and I'm 300 years old. Jamie laughed loudly at that and made both Hiccup and the seller send them questioning looks. Jack was probably right. Those words weren't delivered with any hint of resentment. More like the opposite. Eventually, Hiccup stood in front of Jack with a leather pouch in his hand. It was tied to a belt meant to hang around the waist. He held it out to Jack with a satisfied grin.
I was thinking,
"Gods, no," Jack interrupted, and Hiccup rolled his eyes.
I was thinking, he repeated, it's a bit awkward to go around stepping on mystical crystals all day long. And knowing how quickly you lose your shoes, it's probably better to just put them in this.
Jack looked like he wanted to bicker just for the sake of bickering, but didn't know what to say. So he just took the pouch and smiled down at it like he'd never received a gift in his life. Though it probably had been a while, aside from the drawing Jamie gave him right before things went sideways. He wondered if Jack had left that drawing back on Burke. He hadn't seen him with it in a long while. Maybe he'd lost it. Jamie realized the thought bummed him out a little bit and decided to stop thinking about it. Jack tied the belt around his waist and hid it partly under the sash. They moved to a less crowded part of the market so that Jack could reach into his boot and take out the crystals. Jamie held his breath when he did, scared that they'd somehow passed a magical spot, a trace, he corrected himself internally, without knowing. Jack didn't pass out and put the crystals in the pouch. "Thank you," he told Hiccup. Hiccup just smiled. They kept walking around. Despite Jamie's initial exhaustion, he quickly found that this was a lot more fun than just sitting around or call it an early night. Sitting on Toothless's back almost the entire time probably helped, though. Also, being on the move was better than sitting still and thinking about what Jack had told him last night. Maybe that was the point. Jack seemed to be in a good mood. He and Hiccup were walking on Jamie and Toothless's left, and Hiccup was in the middle of explaining a certain kind of dragon, the Death Song, which Jamie thought was the coolest name ever, and how they'd taken care of a recently hatched one while they lived on the edge. "You must be a good singer, then," Jack said, in response to Hiccup's retelling of how they'd had to constantly sing or play music for the dragon to be manageable. Hiccup barked a laugh.
"Absolutely not."
"Oh, come on,
Jack."
"Hiccup."
"I can sing,"
Jamie interrupted.
"Chestnuts roasting on an open fire."
Jack sent him a long look. "Don't go there."
"Jack Frost nipping at your nose."
Jamie gave a sound between a shriek and a laugh when Jack bonked him on the head with a staff. Jack switched over to English. "Propaganda! It's all propaganda!" he exclaimed, but was quickly laughing as well. Hiccup rolled his eyes good-naturedly.
"I'll assume I just witnessed an inside joke," he said.
"If only," Jack snorted, then bumped into Hiccup, very much on purpose. "I've not forgotten about you. I will hear you sing, one day."
"Are you threatening me?"
Hiccup laughed. Jack pointed his staff at him. "You've seen what I can do."
"Bonk little kids on the head?"
"When they deserve it." He pointed at Jamie, as if to say, "I've not forgotten about you either." Jamie stuck his tongue out at him. "And in case someone goes on to tell any more lies," Jack said, turning his gaze back to Hiccup, "I've never bitten anyone's nose. Who would do such a thing? It's ridiculous." Hiccup's eyes flickered warily between Jack and Jamie.
"Sounds like something someone who bites noses would say,"
he said, then yelped when Jack scoffed at him. He giggled.
"No, actually, I don't want to hear the story behind that. Much better without context."
Jack groaned dramatically. "When will my suffering end?" And in that moment, Babytooth zipped into view, chirping urgently. Hiccup made a choked noise, as if he'd barely contained a scream. "Here?" Jack asked, then frowned as Babytooth continued tweeting at him. "How far? How'd you get all the way? All right?" He looked at Hiccup. "She thinks she's found something and she wants you to confirm." Hiccup blinked.
"Excuse me?"
But Jack was already following Babytooth. Hiccup looked after him for a moment before he turned to Jamie. Jamie could only shrug.
"Maybe you have a bit of magic in you yourself,"
he explained. Hiccup didn't look awfully excited about the idea.